Thank you, Joanne. And we are delighted to have Professor Saul Becker with us today. Saul is the Professor of Children and Families at Manchester Metropolitan University. He has held professorial posts in universities across the United Kingdom before moving to Manchester to establish a new Institute for Children's Futures. He is a world leader for young carers research, policy and practice, and his research and career spanned 30 years. The lovely thing about it is he's a registered social worker, a community organizer, and his work has featured in 9 television documentaries. He was also a young carer in his childhood for his grandmother who had Parkinson's. And we are delighted to have you here with us today, Saul. So I'm going to hand over to you without further ado.
Thank you. Thanks very much indeed. Thanks for the introduction, Audrey and Joanne and Steve, for organising this. I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to talk today to colleagues in the European Association for Palliative Care. So let me say a little bit about the structure of the presentation I'm going to give today. It's really in 3 parts. The first part is about young carers, what we know from 30 years of research, policy and practice, because I started doing this research in 1992. So I've been involved in over 50 research projects since that time. And I want to really point out some of the key findings. Then I want to, if you like, take those findings and identify some of the key messages for palliative care and working with young carers. And that's based on the research, but it's also based on my experiences, as Audrey has said, of being a social worker for over 40 years. So I'm a registered social worker with Social Work England, and I qualified in the early 80s. And I've worked directly in palliative care cases. So I want to then, as I say, point out these messages for practice with young carers in these situations. And then finally, just one slide, say some final words, if you like, by way of summary. So that's the presentation. And as has been said, if you have questions or want to engage in conversation or chat, please type them into the chat bar. And Steve and Joe and Audrey are looking at those, and then at the end of the presentation we'll be able to try to answer as many of those questions or engage in as many of those conversations as possible. So that's the intro. So let me start at the beginning. I don't need to define young carers to this audience, but it's effectively children under the age of 18. They have the legal status of children who are providing care, support, supervision to another family member. And usually it is a parent, but it can be a grandparent or a brother or sister, sibling, or any other relative, or even a friend who has some disability, chronic illness, mental health problem, or any other condition which is connected with a need for care, support, or supervision. And many young carers, as you will see in the presentation, are caring for multiple people in their families with multiple conditions, comorbidity. And so we refer to young carers as children under 18. And there's another phrase that you might hear me use today, which is young adult carers, which are young adults aged 18 to 24. So they're in the transition phase between childhood, which supposedly ends at 18, and early adulthood going on to 24 years of age. So that's the terms that we will be using today. When I started researching 32 years ago, there was very little known about young carers. It was a very hidden and very secret world. Young carers were invisible. There was no in-depth understanding of their lives or experiences, no official research, no official figures rather, and very little research, very little public or professional awareness, and no rights, no entitlements, few services. And effectively, young carers were silenced by this lack of recognition. When I was a young carer as a child, I started caring at the age of 12 and continued to care up to the age of 24 when my grandmother passed away, and I shared that care predominantly with my mother. And then I was lucky that I went to university, did my degree, qualified as a social worker, and then went into practice. But when I was a young carer in the 70s and the 80s, there was nothing whatsoever. And indeed, I didn't know, like many young carers today, that we were young carers. We didn't see it in any way as a sort of badge or anything. We just saw it as our responsibility, our obligation, our duty to provide care for the people that we loved. You know, my grandmother lived with us. She was there. She needed support. My mother was able to provide a lot of that, but my mother and I shared many aspects of that, including intimate personal care, which I'll talk a bit about later on. So over the last 30 years, we've managed to reveal these invisible lives through the publication of many research projects. As I said, I've been involved in 50 studies, multiple articles and books, and many other researchers in the UK and around the world are also researching now more furiously, if you like, around young carers. So 30 years on, what does the situation look like in the UK? Well, now we do have widespread awareness and recognition of young carers in this country. We've got a good research base. We've got specific legal rights for young carers in the United Kingdom. So a young carer has a specific right to have an assessment conducted of their needs and their ability to provide care within their families. And they also have rights to what we call a transitional assessment, which is to determine what support they need going through this phase between 16 really to 18 to 20, the transition between childhood and adulthood. What might they need to get into the labour market, to have a life of their own, and so on. So we are very fortunate in the UK to have these legal rights for young carers that are constructed through a number of different pieces of legislation, which, if you like, go back probably about 20 years, but have been more clarified over the last few years. And we have extensive codes and guidance for professionals, for social workers, for healthcare professionals, and so on. So our child protection or safeguarding guidance, working together, has sections about young carers. We've also had in the past a national young carers strategy, and many local authorities in the UK have local strategies. We've got over 300 dedicated services, local projects for young carers, many of which are provided by charitable and third sector organisations, and multiple different forms of intervention, from casework to group work to making memories, to nice experiences, and so on. So there's lots of different forms of intervention with young carers. And because we've been doing this much longer than many other countries in the world, if you look at a classification of different country responses to young carers, we would be considered to be at the top of that league table. And indeed, we did that work in 2016 and 2021, where we compared the different countries and what they were doing for young carers. Did young carers have specific legal rights? Was this a priority for government? Was there local and national guidance for different professional groups, and so on? And so here you can see that some countries are climbing up this particular league table, some are staying the same, but the UK is at the top, but it doesn't mean we're perfect, indeed far from it. So despite 30 years of research, despite a specific legal infrastructure for young carers, the vast majority of young carers in the UK, probably 8 out of 10, are not assessed at all, despite having that legal right. And other countries are emerging in terms of their policies and their practices for young carers, and following to some extent a model in the UK, but other countries are, if you like, focusing on different things. So in the Scandinavian countries, they don't often refer to children who are carers as young carers. They often refer to them as children who are next of kin. And that's based on the fact that when a person goes into hospital, an adult or a parent goes into hospital, they are asked, who is your next of kin? And if the next of kin is a child under the age of 18, then that child in some of the Scandinavian countries has specific rights as a child who is next of kin, which are akin, if you like, to what we would be doing to support young carers in the United Kingdom. So after 30 years of research and hearing children's voices and learning from practice, what do we know? So we know that different methodologies produce different numbers of young carers. We know what young carers are, what they do. We know that the conditions that of the people that they're looking after range from mental illness, disability, and so on. We know the ages of young carers and how many hours they provide per week. We know from research that as a child gets older, they're expected to do more and more within their family. So a child who's 5 at primary school will be doing something as a young carer, but that will be different from 12, which is the average age, and that will be very different from someone who's, say, 16 or 17, where the volume and quantity and sometimes the complexity of caring increases with age. We know that the outcomes of caring can be positive and negative. We know that there are significant inequalities in terms of educational and health outcomes for children who are carers. We also know from the hundreds of projects and evaluations and things that are going on that services and support can make a real difference for young carers, but we still also know that most young carers are hidden and invisible in the United Kingdom, in the countries that are now engaging with young carers, and particularly in most of the countries in the world which have no recognition whatsoever of the issue around children who are carers. And for the purpose of this meeting today, we know very little about young carers and palliative care. There are not many studies which have focused specifically on this theme, and so I will outline what I think are some of the issues later on. Let me then quickly go through the key building blocks of our research knowledge around young carers. And I've broken this up into 5 or 6 broad headings. Now, I'm going to give you now data, and you'll be able to have these slides in a week or two when they're put up on the website. But I don't want you to be concerned about the minutiae of the figures. It's not the figures that are critical in this narrative. It's the story itself about what children are doing, what their age is, the impact that this has on their psychosocial development, and so on that's important. Not the detail of the figures, drawing on multiple studies that I've been involved in. So the first research finding is about the numbers. And a source of these numbers is actually the census, the national census in the United Kingdom, which has been done in 2001, 11 and 21, in which questions were asked about informal family carers, unpaid family carers, and also about the ages of those carers and how many hours they care per week. And what you can see from this table, which gives the figures for England and Wales in 2001 and 2011, is that there are many children of the young age, 5 to 7, 8 to 9, who are young carers. So if anyone says to you ever, children of a young age can't be young carers, the evidence is that they can. And if you look at all of those figures, all of those age groups from 5 up to 18, effectively between 2 and 3% of all children in the United Kingdom, according to the census, are young carers, and many are very young. And what's very interesting about this method of calculating the numbers of young carers is that it's based on the head of the household completing the census. So it's usually a parent or adult who will complete the census and have to tick the box that there's someone with an illness or disability, tick the box that there's someone who provides unpaid care, then tick the box of the age of that person, and then how many hours that they're caring per week, and so on. And I've always argued, indeed from 2001, over the last 30 years or so, 20 odd years, that that method for counting the number of young carers will seriously underestimate the extent of caring amongst children, because it relies on the adult, the head of the household, disclosing on the census form a number of things which they might not wish to disclose. So what I've argued for is that we need to ask children directly to self-identify and tell us if they're a young carer. And one of the ways we do this is through what's called the MACA, the multi-dimensional assessment of caring activities. And this is a psychometric instrument, an 18-item psychometric instrument, which asks children to tell us whether they do any of these tasks and whether they do them some of the time or a lot of the time or never. It's a very simple tool. It's used in 20 countries and in hundreds of projects, and can be used, of course, in a palliative care situation. And basically, we're asking children to tell us whether they do these things. And you can score it very simply. If it's never, it's naught. If it's some of the time, it's 1. And if it's a lot of the time, it's 2. And you add it all up, and then you've got a score for whether for what children are doing, the amount of caring, and there's subscales within that. The Children's Commissioner for England has suggested that the MACA should be used in all schools in England to identify young carers, and particularly those who may be struggling. And this tool can be used in multiple situations to identify children who have a caregiving role. So the MACA YC18, MACA, Multidimensional Assessment of Caring Activities, Young Carers, 18 questions, asks a range of questions, as I've indicated, about the caring jobs that a child does. In 2018, the second time the MACA was used by the BBC in a survey of school children, what they found was that 22% of all of those school children who completed the MACA in different classrooms were providing some level of care. And then when you look at the scores of the MACA, and a score of over 14 is a high amount, and a score of over 18 is a very high amount of caring, the survey revealed that half of all that 22%, 10% of all children are providing high or very high amounts of care. And that equates in the United Kingdom to 1 million children. So if you want the sort of basic take home from that, is that 1 in 10 children in the United Kingdom have high or very high amounts of care in their families, looking after parents and other family members with illness, disability, mental health, comorbidity. And actually, it's 1 in 5 of all children who are providing some level of care. So that's the kind of scale that we are talking about. And other countries have found similar levels of caring amongst their child population. So if you take Switzerland, for example, the proportion is between 8 and 10%. In other countries, Japan, 4 to 6%, Norway, 6%, Netherlands, 25% of children were discovered to be young carers, and so on. And in the UK, those 3 different figures are to show you the different calculations that have been used. The 2 to 3% in that UK box is what the census tells us. The 8 to 22% is what different studies using the MACA have shown through different BBC surveys, and the 10% is the proportion of all children who are providing high levels of care. This is quite complex because different countries use different age groups as well. So yesterday I met with a delegation of people from South Korea, and they define young carers up to the age of 34. And so different countries using different age bands makes it difficult to make a direct comparison. But you can see here that the proportions are certainly significant. And overall, I would suggest that if you are in an advanced industrialized Western society, that the proportion of children who will be young carers will be at least 10% of all children. And that equates to 3 children in every classroom in the land. 3 children in every classroom in the United Kingdom. And in Australia, they've used a similar figure, even though their proportion is less at 4%. But basically, we are talking about significant numbers of children who are carers. So who are they looking after? What's the conditions of the people that they are supporting? Well, in a survey in 2018 by the BBC using the MACA, we discovered that just under half of the children were looking after their mother, then a sibling, a father, a grandparent. And you can see that those figures don't add up to 100% because 1/3 of all of these children are providing care to more than one person. Now, what's interesting is if you compare the profile of who they're looking after in the UK with, say, Italy or other countries, this distribution between mothers, siblings, fathers, grandparents, and friends varies considerably across different countries. So a study that we did in 6 countries of adolescent young carers aged 15 to 17 shows, for example, that in southern European countries like Italy, grandparents are more likely to be looked after than, say, some other groups. And it's the same, I was told, in South Korea, where the family structure, including grandparents living at home and so on, is if you like, more nuclear than in some other countries where families are more dispersed. So that profile gives you an indication of who is looked after in the UK. And when you look at the conditions that people have, you find that it's a profile around physical disability, mental health, long-term illness, learning disability, drug and alcohol misuse, but often, as I've indicated, a combination of these different conditions. And of course, some of the people that young carers are going to be caring for will have palliative care needs. Their life will be severely affected and they will be potentially in an end-of-life phase. But we do not have reliable data on the proportion of children in those situations. But I'll come back to that later on when I start to talk a bit more about palliative care. The third set of findings concerns the roles that children do and the amount of time that children care for, because there might be an assumption that children are just doing very minor things in the home and maybe just for a few hours a week. But the evidence clearly shows that that's not the case. It's far more substantial and far more regular than that. So I've conducted 3 national surveys from 1995 to 2004, admittedly quite old now, but from those surveys, we were able to construct, if you like, a classification of what is it that children do as carers within the home. And we talked about children providing domestic care, domestic support in the home, cooking, cleaning, and so on. Some are providing general and nursing care, which is giving injections, using hoists to get people out of bed. You know, the kinds of things that we would expect qualified and paid professionals to do, many children are doing that. And in the documentaries I've been involved in, it often shows children involved in nursing support, giving medication, dealing with catheters, etc., etc. Emotional support is the kind of supervision, the reassurance, the being there, the talking, and so on. Intimate personal care includes toileting, showering, feeding, and so on. Sibling care is looking after other brothers and sisters who aren't necessarily disabled or ill themselves, but they are needing care because the parent's capacity to provide that care to the other children in the family is reduced. And then other includes household management, dealing with the household finances, the bills, translating English where English isn't the first language, being the mediator between the professional services of our welfare system and the family. And that classification using those headings has been applied not just in the Free National Service and is shown to be robust, but has been used in multiple studies by other researchers across various countries. And that's the kind of way we classify young carers. There's one more heading that has increasingly, I think, become important, which is the heading of self-care. The fact that young carers have to also provide a lot of care to themselves because maybe it's not possible to receive the quality and the quantity of care for themselves that they might wish for or benefit for, or parents would wish to give because of the illness, disability and circumstances of that family. So in the 2018 BBC survey, what's interesting, I think, is that 10% of those young carers that the BBC identified were involved in personal and intimate care, and nearly half were involved in emotional care. This is just to give you a flavour of the kinds of things that children are doing. But the census, which I told you I don't rely on because it's filled in by the adult, also indicates the number of hours that children are performing care. So given that this underestimates the extent of caring and its nature, it's shocking to see that even when the adult fills in the census, you have here examples where in 2011, 5, 6 and 7-year-olds and 8 and 9-year-olds were providing over 50 hours of care a week, according to the adult in the home, or 20 to 49 hours. And you can see the distribution for other age groups as well. So you can see here that many children are providing long hours of caring per week, including very young children of primary school age. Now, the 2021 census, I haven't used these figures because it was effectively the COVID census in which because it was literally in the middle of the COVID pandemic and people were at home, children weren't at school, the data we do not believe is as reliable. But what we do know from the 2021 census is that the amount of caring, the intensity of caring by children has actually increased. So there are young children, as I've said, who are providing many hours of care per week. And that has increased into the 2021 census, and it increased from the 2001 to the 2011 census, and now it's increased again. The pattern effectively is that younger children are growing in numbers as carers and taking on many more hours of caring. And that's a pattern that's gone over the last 20-odd years through the 3 different UK censuses. The fourth finding concerns the outcomes of caring. And what we know is that they include both positive and negative outcomes. And that's what I'm going to summarize now. So when the research started 30 years ago, many of the outcomes that we identified through surveys and qualitative research talked about the negative outcomes of caring for children, the restricted friendships. Do you want to have friends come home to your house if your parent has severe mental health problems, if they are misusing alcohol or drugs, and that's the reason they need support from their children, etc. So it has been clear that restricted friendships and a sense of stigma by association with the person who needs the care has occurred in many families. And there has been a genuine fear by children, but fear by parents as well, of the interventions that might occur from social workers and other healthcare professionals. Would we be wanting, for example, to take a child into care or define this as a safeguarding issue rather than a family support issue where there may be mental health problems or whatever. And this is something, if you want to, we can discuss more. So there's been silence, there's been secrets. Many children have reported emotional problems, health problems, including physical and mental health difficulties, and then educational difficulties. The fact that it's hard to get to school, you're falling asleep, you're not doing as well, you're being bullied, but you're also, some children who are young carers are bullies, and so on. So the first sort of 10 years of findings was very much around the negatives. And then over time, we've started to see and understand the positives, the sense of maturity and responsibility that children gain from caregiving. Some people call it a false maturity. Some people have referred to it as parentification in some of the mental health literature, or growing up too early. But there is clearly a maturity amongst many young carers, which is different from some other children, including an ability to multitask, to work on different issues within the home, the intimate care needs of a parent, the household finances or the management, as well as the emotional support, trying to get to school, trying to get home to cook a meal, and so on. But there's also a sense that these caring roles give some control by children over their circumstances, and a sense of inclusion, being involved, being important. And some people have argued that that develops their sense of resilience, although I think that might be contested. In a study in 2013, we discovered something that really surprised us, a study of just under 300 young carers and young adult carers. And the surprising finding of that was when we asked them to tell us about their illnesses and disabilities, theirs, not their parents', we found that nearly half of the children and young people reported that they had mental health problems of their own, from the stress, etc., of caring and the reactions to them as young carers from others outside the family. And you can see some other illnesses or disabilities that they reported. That was a surprise finding, and and led to us conducting a 3-year study in 6 European countries on the mental health of adolescent young carers aged 15 to 17. And it's called the Me-We study, and looks at 2,099 young carers, adolescent young carers of that age. And what we discovered in that particular study, with a significant sample of over 2,000 young carers, is that you could see in the chart that many had negative school performance as a result of caring. Many experienced bullying. Others had physical health problems, mental health problems. Some, and this was the first time in any piece of research, we discovered that some of the young carers or adolescent young carers had been considering hurting themselves because of their caregiving roles, and others had considered hurting others, including the person receiving care. So you can see here that some of those negative outcomes of caring manifest themselves in very real ways for adolescents, and actually the proportions are different in different countries. The fifth set of findings is around the transitions to adulthood. Many of you in the room will be aware that just because a child stops being a child legally, a child at the age of 18, their caregiving role continues, and often continues not just into their 20s, but could continue into their 30s and beyond, depending on the health needs of the person receiving care. So over the last 10 years or so, we've become increasingly interested in the transitions of young carers into being young adult carers, and so on. And these results say a little bit about that. We did a survey, as I said, in 2013, and it looked at the age group 14 to 25, because we wanted to capture young carers under 18 and young adult carers 18 to 24, 25, to see whether there was a pattern in terms of their experiences at school, at college or university, in work or not in education, employment, and training. And the average age of the young carers in this survey was 10 when they started caring. So we're talking about relatively young age in which our sample started to caring. And I'm just going to give you one slide of our calculations which show what the caring impact is in terms of their school attendance, university, and so on. And what we were able to calculate from the data that we had on this sample was that the young carers at school of school age, a quarter of their days were affected by their caring role, and 5% of their days were actually missed due to caring. If you then look at the young adult carers at college or university, so, you know, between 16 to sort of 22, that group, what we found was that half of their days at college or university are affected by their caring roles because their parents or mums or siblings or whatever are at home, and 3 days per month were missed due to caring responsibilities. Now, what's interesting here is that, you know, you've got significant numbers of school kids and college and university pupils, students, who are missing significant amounts of days, you know, in terms of their education and their learning. When you then look at the young adult carers who were in the paid labour market in work, you can see then that 79 days per year were affected from their caring roles and 17 days per year were lost entirely because of caring. Now, these figures say to us that if we want to ensure that young carers and young adult carers are able to play a full role in school, college, university, and work, we need to recognise that there is significant pressures on them to miss those places, school, college, work, that to miss days there because of their caring role. And so obviously we would be looking to schools, colleges, universities, and employers to be thinking about how can they be sensitive to the needs of young carers? How can they accommodate and get the best out of these children and young people in these different settings? And there is significant pressure on colleges and universities now to be carer friendly, as there is in schools. And there are strategies and initiatives and interventions in schools, colleges, and universities for trying to support young carers, specifically in those places. And now employers too are beginning to wake up to this issue. And the final set of research findings is really the concepts that we can now create, develop through this body of research evidence. So the first is really, why do children become carers? Why is it that a child in a family will take on a caregiving role? And there are multiple reasons, but effectively, they relate to the fact that the child, in most cases, lives in the family where there is someone with an illness or disability or comorbidity, which acts as a trigger to someone having to provide care within that family. And so there are cultural issues around that. There are relational issues. They are literally in the family. There is a bond of duty, of love, and so on. In some families, there is a sense of an intergenerational contract, which itself is culturally associated, where children will be looked after by older parents and grandparents, and then feel a responsibility to look after their own parents and grandparents when they become ill or disabled. And the intergenerational contract, which is unwritten but is culturally applied, is very much an issue in the global South countries where research has been done. And some children are socialized into these roles from very early age. They become institutionalized in those roles, particularly if a child starts very early and so on. So this is why children become carers. And I think we can understand caring along a continuum from children on the left-hand side of this chart, which is most children who are caring about family members, friends, and strangers. We need to encourage people to care about others. And in some families that will involve routine, low levels of caring, including some help with instrumental tasks of daily life. But there is little evidence in those situations of profound negative outcomes. But as we move from that left-hand side towards the right-hand side, some children are starting to do more tasks. The tasks increase in the level of complexity, regularity, intimacy, duration, and so on. So they're moving from caring about people to starting to take care of people. And by the time you get to the right-hand side, you've got children who are caring for. And they are the young carers. It's a fewer group than the 11 million in the UK who are children. We're talking about 1 million who are providing more substantial and heavy amounts of caring, providing higher levels in complex tasks in family lives, and the evidence of significant negative outcomes for some children. So you can see that this continuum of children's caring is a way of understanding what's going on. So if we take that continuum, what is the task that we have as social workers, allied healthcare professionals, and so on, and teachers? What is it that we should be doing for young carers? And I would argue that we should be moving children from a position of vulnerability, which would include providing inappropriate care that is disturbing to children and to parents and family members to receive, where it's excessive, far too excessive for the age of that particular child, where it's leading to restricted educations and life chances, affecting their well-being, giving them a sense of isolation, increasing their mental health problems or their own anxieties, and overall having a high impact on their psychosocial development and their opportunities and futures. That is how I am defining vulnerability. And we need to move young carers from that position of vulnerability to a position of growth, where they can learn, thrive, achieve, feel protected, enjoy, be supported, be identified, be assessed, and to flourish as children. Now, that's no easy task, given the complexity of family lives, given the complexities of the illnesses and disabilities and so on that children are living with, coping with, and often having to care for. But it is, if you like, the goal of what we should be doing. And increasingly, or recently, certainly, the service providers who are working directly with young carers are thinking through what is the purpose of a young carers project? What is the purpose of the interventions that they are providing for the hundreds of thousands of children who are young carers that they are working with? And the conversation has been about prevention. Should we be preventing children from caring? Should we be actually trying to prevent it from taking place? And that would require far greater interventions from health, from social care, from a whole range of different services to meet the needs of the person who has the care needs themselves, so that children don't have to do those caring roles. Or is it about reduction? Is it about reduction in terms of trying to reduce the amount of care that children are providing in families? Or is it about assisting, helping children to adjust by giving them some support, but not trying to reduce the amount of caring, but supporting them so that they can better adjust to their caring roles and responsibilities? Or is it a combination of those things, helping a child get a better care-life balance? Or is it about supporting the whole family, which could involve any of the others, giving more support to the person with care needs, preventing, reducing, assisting the young carer? So these are some of the things now that young carers projects are thinking through. And what would be our purpose in terms of palliative care situations? It would be very hard to prevent children from having to take on some caring roles in end-of-life situations. But should we be wanting to try and reduce the amount of caring that some children are doing in those situations, or help them adjust better to it, or focus on the family to try and meet the needs of all the family? So let me now turn to the final set of slides, just four slides, which turn to palliative care. What we know from much research around palliative care, and people in the room will be experts on this, is that families and children's needs are not consistently being met when a parent is dying. And we know from research in hospices that around 5 to 10% of hospice patients do have children under 18, but there is no reliable data that I'm aware of which tells us the number or the proportion of children who are providing care to parents and other family members who need palliative care in all settings, hospices, community, hospitals, and so on. So there is very little specific research in the field of young carers and palliative care. So what I'm going to say now is the messages from the research that I've talked about and from my own experiences as a social worker, etc., and apply those to palliative care situations. So let me first offer some reflections on the needs of young carers who are providing palliative care. And those needs are around practical support, psychological, respite, information and communication, and coordination. So let me highlight some of the things that I think are important here. I think young carers certainly need to understand the health condition and the care needs of the parent or the family member who is facing end of life, and how those change over time. So having a good understanding of what the pattern is and what's likely to happen is really important. And many young carers have no real knowledge of the health conditions. And some healthcare practitioners are frightened, in fact, of telling children about the health conditions, particularly in palliative care situations. But we do know that honesty in these situations can be very helpful, and explaining to children in a way that they can understand, process and manage can also be very helpful to prevent or reduce the likelihood of negative traumatic responses later on. So we have to prepare children emotionally and practically with our help for what might happen, what will happen. We need to see children who are young carers in terms of giving them help with the caregiving itself. So you wouldn't, I hope, I don't think any in our room would expect children to do all of the palliative care. We should see them as partners in caring. Although I have to say that I do know of some cases going back some years where children and young people have been involved in most of the care, particularly in situations. I think of two people that I'm aware of, I know, who did most, if not all, of the care around cancer of a dying parent at home. We need to create positive memories, and you all are aware of the importance that children hold on to and have positive memories in these difficult times, and that they need to look after their own physical and mental health, eat as well as they can, and so on. They need to make time for themselves, and they also need to use this delicate time to speak about what's important to them with the parent, with other family members, not leave these things. And some of us, myself included, regret that we didn't have those kind of conversations when we could have had them because we were frightened or whatever to have them at that particular time, and then the opportunity has gone. So I do believe that whilst they're incredibly painful, they're important conversations to have, and I think some parents would want to have those conversations too, to prepare their child, etc. Children need breaks, respite care. They, I think, will benefit from telling their school, college, university, workplace what's happening. I think it's useful to have an emergency plan for various situations. So, what happens if the child themselves becomes ill and can't provide the care that day or that week or whatever? What's the emergency plan that's going to, if you like, provide the care for the person who needs the support? Or what's the emergency plan if the parent passes whilst the child is at home, or the child returns from school to find the parent has passed or the family member has passed. Having in place an emergency plan for various scenarios, I think can be really helpful, you know, with practical phone numbers and people who will be contacted and people who can come in to support, etc., is important. And I think it's also important for a child to know what to expect if they'll be with the person at the very end. You know, what are they likely to see? How will they process that, and so on. Now, it's important also to understand that young carers' life after caring will be very different. And for young carers experiencing this sort of anticipatory grief, this loss in the future, will be the worst time in their life. But one hopes and one prays and one intervenes to try and reduce the long-term negative outcomes of this period in a child's life. And of course, the developmental stage of the young carer themselves will affect their understanding, their way of processing and dealing with their responses to death and to grief. So, you know, primary school kids of 5, 6, and 7 have different ways of processing and understanding these things from a 14-year-old or an 18-year-old, and so on. So we need to ensure that what we do is age development appropriate. But in the context of young carers' life after caring, we need to understand that many young carers will want to participate in the funeral in the way or ways that they want, that they will need to receive help in the home with the belongings, with the bills, with the practical arrangements. And in some cases, young carers might actually be at risk of losing their home if it's a child in a one-parent household and the parent has died and the child is 12 or 13, and it was a tenancy agreement. That child cannot have legally a tenancy. So where are they going to live? Who are they going to live with, and so on? I think it's important that children have the opportunity to talk and to get help and support to navigate their grief, loss, bereavement, and indeed start to understand their own emotional and physical responses to these situations. They need to take time and space and be kind to themselves in these situations, do things that they enjoy, and make sure that they can do these things guilt-free without worrying or thinking, I shouldn't be enjoying myself when mum has passed or dad has passed or whatever, you know. But it is important for people to find that equilibrium, and sometimes that equilibrium can be restored or through getting into a routine relatively quickly, getting back into school, college, university, and so on. And of course, with the loss of the caring role, there is a change in identity, because for some kids, they will not be young carers anymore. And so they need to reevaluate, revalue themselves and their identity, because they have, if you like, moved beyond. And some kids will feel terribly guilty. And some kids might feel relieved to some extent that they don't have to provide the kinds of care that we've talked about over the last 45 minutes or so. So these are very delicate things. We also need to recognize, and children need to recognize, that there will be triggers that can make life upsetting and unsettling for them. Things that they might smell or hear, a piece of music, a particular food or whatever, that's going to trigger some elements of unsettlement or sorrow, or in extreme cases, despair. But at the end of the day, we need to help children find joy. My final words. Young carers are everyone's business. They relate to all of us, to people working in all fields, in schools, in health centres, in GP practices, in social work teams. They're a part of children's services, they're a part of adult services, and so on. And we do know that early interventions can prevent those caring roles from becoming institutionalised and normalised within families. We know that services and interventions will improve young carers' health, their mental health, their educational experiences, their labour market participation and well-being. So that is why you see more and more services and initiatives being developed for young carers in multiple different settings. And in palliative care situations, given everything we've said, a whole family approach and, you know, support, identification, recognition and support for the whole family is critical, because the needs of the child who is the carer and the person who is facing end of life and so on, all of these needs are interdependent. And so identifying what each person needs requires to function, to flourish, or to manage and get by is critical. Now, this requires ultimately a greater professional awareness and training amongst all the different multi-professional teams, social workers, healthcare professionals, doctors, teachers, etc., about young carers, and especially about those children providing end-of-life care. Our systems and training for all of these professional groups, as you know, is far from adequate about children's caring roles and children's caring roles in end-of-life situations. We know that young carers need to have someone to talk to. For some, that's a valve to let out the steam. But for others, it has a profound therapeutic benefit. And whether that's in schools, by professionals, young carers projects, etc., for some people, it will be very informal. A domestic worker, a pastoral member of a school, a catering or whatever. In other cases, it will be counsellors, child and adolescent mental health services, and so on. We need to have a no wrong door policy, the identification of children who are carers in any setting or place, which doesn't require them to go through multiple doors to find help and support, so that we as agencies, as professionals, link our services. So if a child asks me for support, I can give my support, but I can also connect them to other forms of support that will benefit them, rather than them having to go to 5 or 6 different agencies or professional groups and so on. And finally, we must never forget the importance of assessments, including the assessment of their transitions and the assessment that will take place after caring when someone has died, because those children, if they're 16, 17 or whatever, now face a different trajectory in their childhood and transition into adulthood than they did before. So we need to ensure that children who are carers are identified and they're assessed, so that we know what their needs are, and so we can then identify how best to support them in any of the caring situations that I've described this afternoon, including palliative care situations. So that's my presentation. Indeed, thank you for listening, everybody. And I'm now going to hand this over to Stephen and others to move us forward. And with permission, I will now stop sharing my slides.
Saul, thank you so much for that. That was it was just quite humbling, actually. I mean, and what comes through is your absolute passion for this subject. So, you know, thank you for that. There's clapping hands going up the screen, as you can see. I think one thing that really you're world renowned on this subject, and you know, we're so grateful at the EAPC to have you talking. And I think one of the signs of that is that the people on this call from China, India, and Indonesia. So that's how far your reach is. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you for that humbling talk. I think some of the numbers there, just, you know, when you're saying that 45% of young carers have mental health problems, it's just quite, you know, it's just quite that's just a humbling number, isn't it? So you know, thank you so much for that. Are you happy to? There's some really great questions in the chat as well. Are you happy to take those now? Do you need a moment?
I'll be delighted. I always find, Stephen, this part for me, the part where I really learn. So I've been looking forward to the chat and the questions and the conversation. So thank you. Please proceed. Yeah.
Okay, so we've got a question from a Dr. Das, who I think is from India, asking you, are the group of young carers or young adult carers rendering their services voluntarily or as part of national government services, if any?
Thank you. So, so this is a really interesting question. They're not, so government policy in the UK and in most of the other countries doesn't mandate that children should provide care. Indeed, in the countries that have a response to young carers, there's increasingly a sense that actually this is a problem. That's why they're starting to respond, and that children are doing too much too early, etc. So the role that children take in families is predominantly, we would call, voluntary. But in a number of articles, I've said that it's not really voluntary. It's a labor, thank you. It's a sort of forced labor of love, really, in that children don't really have an alternative. So if we define it as voluntary, it's voluntary with no alternative, and I'm not sure what we call that, because in many of the families we're talking about, these are children in low-income families, in systems where there are welfare benefits for disabled, ill people, etc., and good national health services and good welfare infrastructures. Children still have to provide care, and so what they do is slightly different from what they might do, say, in the global south. But effectively, it's a forced labor of love. So it's not really voluntary, but it's not mandated by the government. But children, if you like, are elected into caring roles within families, by families, and then take on those roles. They become socialized into them. They go on for many years. They have the negative outcomes, and so on. So yeah, that's my answer to that particular question.
Thank you. Another question from Daniel Thangasamy, I think also from India as well. Does the term young carers include children who are not taking care of the patient directly, but have responsibility to take care of siblings, other household works when the parent is ill and is away for their treatment or something like as in cancer?
Yeah, so that's a really helpful question. Thank you, Daniel. So generally, we refer to young carers as providing support to an ill or disabled parent or family member. So our definition it corresponds with the definition of informal family care, which is used around the world, and unpaid family care. So where a child is not providing care to someone who is ill or disabled, but is providing other support to the family, some people might say, well, they're not a young carer because they're not providing support to the person who needs care. They're doing other things within the house, household tasks, but not providing care. Now, I would say that in those situations, actually, they are a young carer. So I'm answering this question directly. In my view, they are a young carer, because I would put it to you, Daniel, and others, that a child who's living in a family where parental illness or disability is occurring, particularly if there is comorbidity, isn't likely just to be doing little bits and bobs with the siblings, etc. It would be hard to conceive that they weren't being drawn into other caregiving roles for the ill or disabled family members themselves. And in the classification that I showed you early on in the presentation, one of the things that I put up was that young carers are often providing care and support to siblings who aren't ill or disabled. Yeah. So in that way, those children that Daniel's talking about do correspond to be young carers. But I do believe that in many cases, those children are providing other forms of care to the parents as well. It might not be visible because it might be emotional support. It might not be intimate or personal care, which is clearly seeable, but it might be a lot of kinds of unseen caring responsibilities within the family. So yes, they are young carers.
I suppose though, that just adds another layer of invisibility, if that's such a thing, to an already invisible group, doesn't it? I mean, I think that's one of the things that I always find most difficult with this, is that we those of us practicing in palliative care, do we see these children, and do we see them as young carers? I mean, I'm going to use my my Joker card as the co-facilitator to ask one of my own questions. So, do you mind commenting on that, Saul?
So I think, look, there's a movement now. There's an organization called SIBS, which is all about children who are looking after siblings, some of whom will be disabled and some of whom won't. And I think what we have to understand is that most young carers are invisible anyway. And so you're right that there is a sort of, this is even more another layer of invisibility, because they might not be providing things that can be visibly seen. Like intimate personal care can be visibly seen. We all know what that is. But if they're providing emotional support, supervision, reassurance, talking to someone when they're hearing voices or whatever, then that's not seen. And you know, it was only in the last 20 years or so that emotional support and supervision have started to be really understood as an aspect of informal, unpaid family care. When I started being a researcher sort of 40 years ago, it was very much around the visible acts of caregiving that defined informal care. But we all now know that emotional support, and given that half of the young carers are involved in emotional support is critical. And in some families where palliative care needs are having to be met, that emotional support will be even more important. For the child to give it will be important. For the parent to receive it will be important. So you're right, it is another layer of invisibility, but we have to recognize as professionals where these different caregiving roles are taking place and work out what support we can give or provide, manage or organize at the right time for that family.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful way of looking at it. Thank you. I'm going to go back to some of the questions from other people rather than taking up with just my own issues. So we've got another question from Annika Paul. I think it's Annika Paul rather than Paul Annika. If there are more than one child in a family who are potential young carers, are there any findings about why one particular child takes up the caregiving responsibility? For example, the eldest is more responsible, or the youngest is more vulnerable while older siblings have moved away, or that young carers, or their personality, which is a fascinating question that I would never have even thought of.
So this is a really good question, and it's one that I have been asked quite a few times. So let me tell you what the research tells us. The research really, because some people would say, is the dominant factor, characteristic, the gender? Is it girls' work? So a lot of the research on informal care, particularly about adults who are informal carers, focused around the gendered dimension of caring. Women were more likely to care or provide care than men. In the context of young carers, what we know is that gender does play a role. And so girls are more likely to provide longer amounts of care and more complex amounts of care than boys, on average. But that is only the tip of the iceberg, because the reality is that in some families, there may not be a girl, there might just be a son, and it might be caring for a mother, or it might be a daughter caring for a father. And what we know in those situations is that you can have cross-gender caregiving roles, which might break some taboos, for instance, about intimacy between a father needing intimate help from a daughter or a mother from a son, etc. So gender is important, but it's only a small part of the equation. What's important is age, the age order of children. And we know that as a child gets older, they're expected to do more. So if there's an older child in the family, they might be expected to be the carer or to share the care with other people. But in some families, the older person will also then hopefully leave to go to college or university, and that will leave a younger child behind to provide care. And so in those situations, age becomes irrelevant because they have moved on to their own independence if they can get to college or university, knowing that they're leaving a younger sibling to provide care. In some cases, as Anika said, it might be to do with the personality of the child, in that there are some children who would be seen to be more caring. That might be related to gender, it might be related to personality, it might be related to the way they speak or the way that they behave or whatever. And so personality is important. In some cases, it will be about the closeness of the relationship. Some children and parents don't get on. And a parent might be less keen to have a child that they argue with more, or they might be more keen to have that child providing their care because they don't want the child that they get on really well with to do the intimate caring tasks. So every family is different, is my answer to this. Every family that I've worked with is different. But what we do know for sure is that as the child becomes, and I talk about them being elected into a caregiving role. So some children, it might not be the choice of the parent, but the children will elect a particular child to be the carer because of these different combinations of things, these intersectional issues. So a child will be elected into the caring role. And once they're elected into that role and it becomes institutionalized and normalized, it's increasingly difficult for them to step out of that role, or it's increasingly difficult for other children to intervene and take on more of the responsibilities. So one of the tasks we have to do is to think about, is it prevention? Is it reduction? Is it all the other things I referred to before? Because, or do we really want multiple children, where there are multiple children in a family, to share the caregiving role, to negotiate between them with the parent and with the professionals, almost like a family group conference type situation. Who's going to do what, and how will that enable all people in the family to have as much time to be themselves as possible? I hope that's answered that question.
Brilliant, thank you. Just to say, we've got a lovely message from Elisa Shepherd saying, apologies, I have to leave now, but just want to say a huge thank you for such a passionate, driven presentation. It's really given me food for thought to reflect on my practice as a social worker within palliative care, which is really what we want, isn't it? So thank you for saying that, Lisa. She may well have already left, but I just thought I didn't want you to miss that. I think Joe will probably give you the chat afterwards, but I just didn't want to miss that. Another really helpful question from Phoebe Cooper. You mentioned honesty about diagnosis and prognosis helps. Have any other significant protective factors been identified aside from the positive impacts mentioned amongst young carers?
So Phoebe, thank you for that question. That's really interesting. I think the research is too early about the protective factors around young carers. So yes, we know that honesty, transparency, etc., can be really important to try and reduce the negative outcomes that might follow the traumatic outcomes, the surprise and unexpectedness. But we also need to recognize that honesty and transparency needs to be communicated, to be part of the conversation, which is commensurate to what a child can understand and cope and process. There are other protective factors that come out of the young carers literature that we can recognize. So one of the key protective factors for helping young carers navigate through some of the negative and experiences that I talked about in the first part of the presentation is the importance of parents. So even though parents are in need of care, where a parent can absolutely have ambitions for their child and want the best for their child and want to support their child's education, have time for their child despite their own healthcare needs and so on, where the parent is giving where there is that real sense of reciprocity. Because I don't believe that children become their parents' parent, okay, when they're a young carer. I absolutely see the reciprocity between parents and children. Parents are still parents, trying to parent the best they can in most situations, in very difficult circumstances of ill health, end of life, etc., etc. So where parents can be as engaged with their children's needs as possible, that is definitely a protective factor that we can recognize in different pieces of research. And then there are the other protective factors, if you like, of the external interventions that can happen within families, not just the internal protective family factors, but where there are interventions from social workers, healthcare professionals within the family, which negotiate, say, the caring roles of different family members, the demands or the needs of people receiving care, what family members and children will do, and what we will provide into that family at the right time as social workers and others. That itself becomes a really important protective factor, which will, if you like, hopefully give the child the opportunity to eventually thrive and flourish, as I said, to move them from a position of vulnerability to a position of growth.
Fantastic, thank you. Annika wanted to say thank you. She said thank you in the chat for your response to the last question, so that was really good to hear. Daniel has another question, which is, how do we support young carers who are not visiting hospital, unable to contact, who we are unable to contact through other sources, if the hospital is very far in another town, another city? I mean, this is something that we certainly have at King's, where I work. We have patients from a huge geographical area. We often never even know that they've got children until we ask. So what's your thoughts on that, Saul?
So a couple of things I'd like to say. So last week on Thursday, I had a dinner with quite a few different professional groups, one of whom was the chief medical officer for a particular authority, health authority. And what was really interesting was we were talking about hospitals. Let me just say a little bit about hospitals. One of the things that hospitals might want to do, and this is relating to really what happens in Scandinavian countries with children who are next of kin. If a parent, if an adult comes into hospital who's a parent with an illness, disability, or whatever it might be, and they are asked who is their next of kin, so they might be coming as an inpatient or an outpatient, but it doesn't matter. If they're asked who are their next of kin, then they may say their child, they may say their daughter or their son. Now, if you don't ask for the age of their daughter or their son, you might assume that that's a 40-year-old daughter and this is a 65-year-old mother, yeah? But it might well be that that daughter or son is actually aged 14. They are effectively a child who is the next of kin, okay? And in the Scandinavian countries, that gives those children particular rights, because when that parent is discharged back into their own home, they will most likely be under the care of that child. Are you with me? So one of the things that this person said to me was that, oh, it'd be really interesting for him to find out whether the age of the next of kin is recorded. We didn't think it would be. So a change in hospitals in terms of recording the age of the next of kin will identify many children who are potentially going to be the unpaid carer of that person, or are already the unpaid carer of that person. That's the first point. And that would then lead to us being able to do more within the hospital system and the healthcare system to identify young carers and hopefully do something about them. But where children are caring outside the hospital system, you know, in the rural village in the middle of Wales or wherever it might be. And I wrote a report about this many years ago about young carers in sort of in more rural situations, or in areas where the hospital is 10 miles, 15 miles away, or where there is very few health and social care ecosystems around that particular locality or whatever. then it is much more difficult. And so I think that one of the things that needs to happen in those situations is that we hope that there will be an infrastructure of third sector charitable NGO type organizations. So young carers projects are scattered all over the country. So one of the resources that children use is a local young carers project, which helps to support them, which will do a lot of the things that we've talked about today. And those young carers projects often work with schools, with GP practices, and so on. So it is about finding a source of help or support for the young carer, which is, if you like, distant to the hospital healthcare system. And there are other charities and third sector organizations. And don't forget that every young carer, wherever they live, whether they live in the middle of a city or in the middle of or in a rural setting, has a specific legal right to an assessment of their needs and ability to continue to care, as well as a transition assessment. And they need to simply ask social services, children's services, or others can ask on their behalf for that assessment to be conducted. It might be conducted by a social worker working for the local authority. It might be conducted by a Young Carers Project or someone else who's commissioned to do that. But that should be the gateway to services. But let's not also forget that only 2 out of every 10 young carers has had that specific legal right met by their local authority, because in many cases, they don't know they have that right.
Thank you. A slightly different question on a different tag, but I think really interesting. So Jade Cormack, who I think is from an organisation called Our Time, she says, we work with children of parents with a mental illness, and we find lots of young carers within this group, but they often don't identify or class as young carers because the support they provide tends to be more emotional and often episodic in nature, depending on the type of mental illness, and they struggle to access support. Is the term young carer perhaps limiting in some ways, preventing some from accessing support because they don't fit that label? Another fascinating question.
Yeah, really good question, Jade. Thanks for that one. So I actually don't think it is limiting. I think it's empowering, enabling, and opens doors. So 30 years ago, when I started, we didn't really have the term. 50 years ago, when I was a carer, we didn't have any sense of what this group were or anything. And so the term young carer now has been integrated, assimilated into legislation, into guidance for social workers, teachers, and so on. So it is a phrase that is hard won in terms of 30 years of research, of campaigning, of lobbying, of multiple people and agencies working. So it is understood. It is understood by professionals, by policymakers, by local authorities, and so on. So the challenge isn't to get rid of the phrase. The challenge is to enable more children to recognize that what they're doing in their families is caring. And as I've said a number of times this afternoon, emotional support and supervision, even if it doesn't include the practical physical tasks that carers can do, is caring, yeah? And the emotional support that children have to do, the responsibility, the always being worried and anxious about a parent, listening to their voices and experiencing their fears and anxieties, some of which are through mental health thoughts, etc., and others which are real anxieties that relate to how we're going to pay the bill this week. These cast a shadow forward on young carers' own psychosocial development and on their own emotions and mental health. So children who are caring for parents with mental illness, who are providing predominantly emotional support, as well as other aspects, but predominantly emotional support, are absolutely young carers. And we need to recognize the kinds of outcomes or impacts that kind of responsibility has on children. And we need to help children recognize that being identified themselves, identifying and then being identified as a young carer should open doors rather than become a stigmatizing aspect of their childhood.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm just conscious of time and the fact that you've been talking for the last hour and a half. So I just think we'll take one more question if that's okay, and then we'll say our thank yous. I'm actually going to take a question from some people sent in questions prior to coming on the webinar. So I'm just going to take one of those questions, which I think is another interesting perspective. So I don't necessarily know who this is from. What are the spiritual care frameworks and guidelines for young carers? What are the tips for the young carers?
What are the spiritual care
frameworks and guidelines for young carers? Because I think that's something that we in palliative care, I often, when I'm doing an assessment, I often forget the spiritual side of things. And again, I'm just thinking perhaps with young carers, again, I'm not necessarily thinking about their spirituality.
So, you know, this is the first time this question's ever been asked of me. And I hate to think that the last question I might not be able to answer.
Or shall I do another one then?
Well, actually, I do find it a really interesting. I find it a really interesting question because I've never engaged. The young carers that I've worked with have never really engaged in conversations about spiritual aspects. But I do, you know. But I have had Muslim young carers, I've had Christian young carers, I've had Jewish young carers, and one's always wanting to be sensitive to their own religions and to what they're. So, you know, in different religious groups, there are different processes and things, symbolic and practical and emotional and spiritual, that take place. So it is obviously about making sure that those are followed. But I don't really have a great answer to that question, Stephen, because it's not something that I know much about, and it's certainly not come out in any of the research that I'm aware about in terms of young carers and palliative care.
Yeah, and that's possibly why I chose that question from this list, because it really stuck out for me, because it really was kind of very left field, but made me think that perhaps I'm not thinking about the spiritual needs of the young people that we're trying to support.
Yeah, and so I'm grateful for the question, even though I can't particularly answer it, because it makes, like I said to you, I enjoy these bits because I learn and think then, and that makes me think, yeah, what are those spiritual needs that children will need and have, and also their family members, you know.
Yeah, I mean, and certainly, you know, what struck me was that you earlier on said that, you know, one of the ways that we could identify young carers is they're just translating for their parents or mediating for their parents. And I know we try to avoid it, but I see it in our hospital. Will often a young person will translate on behalf of the parent, and even when we have a translation device that we can take with us, and they'll often say, "Oh, don't bother using that. I'll just translate for mum."
Yeah,
and I think, well, are we you know, taking advantage of young people in that way as well?
and I think what's interesting about the example you've just given, Stephen, is that many of the children who are translating, where English isn't the first language, may well be translating concepts that they have no real understanding of because of their developmental stage, and may have no real understanding about what that illness, let's say it's a translation about an illness or disease or whatever, they might translate it, but they might not know what it actually means. What's the trajectory of that illness or disease? Are people going to get better? Are they going to get remission? Are they going to face end of life? How long might that be? So I think we have to be very careful about children translating things, particularly where it is so sensitive and they might not understand, because I think that has to be a part of the conversations we talked about before, where it's a very much a sensitive conversation, age appropriate, that is about helping children understand what's happening.
Absolutely. Listen, thank you again so much for this talk. I mean, we're just coming up to 4 o'clock now, and I don't want to take up any more of your time. But I just want to say thank you on behalf of the EAPC, because it's really given me a great deal of food for thought, and I'm sure it has for all the other participants. And we will definitely get the chat to you, because there's some really fantastic comments in there, and particularly in reference to the questions that you've answered and how you've answered them. So thank you so much for that. I think Audrey's here again.
Thank you, Saul. It was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the opportunity to talk to you all today. Because I haven't been able to see the chat, because obviously being engaged, I'd love to see the questions and what people were saying, because it's always really important for me to know whether what I've spoken about is what you wanted me to speak about. And can I just say that you have got my email, people in the room. If there are things that you want to pursue or want details of, or references or whatever, please just email me at s.becker@mmu.ac.uk. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. I think to all of our participants, I think Joe is going to stay on for a while just to make sure that everybody can get their certificates. But once again, thank you so much, Saul. I hope we can keep in touch. And yeah, thank you from everyone at EAPC.
Thanks very much, everybody. Have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you.